July 20, 1944. Wolf's Lair, East Prussia. A bomb explodes in Adolf Hitler's conference room. When the smoke clears, Hitler emerges, wounded but alive. The assassination attempt, led by his own officers, has failed. But here's the question that haunts history. What if it had succeeded? You might think the Allies would have celebrated. The monster behind the Holocaust, dead. The architect of Nazi aggression, eliminated. Victory would come sooner, wouldn't it? The truth is far more disturbing. By 1944, Allied intelligence had reached a chilling conclusion. Adolf Hitler alive was more valuable to them than Adolf Hitler dead. The Führer had become, inadvertently, one of the Allies' most effective weapons against Nazi Germany. This is the dark reason the Allies kept Hitler alive. Act 1. The Pattern of Disaster. It began with confidence. In the early years of World War II, Hitler's audacious decisions had paid off spectacularly. The remilitarization of the Rhineland, the annexation of Austria, the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia, all achieved without firing a shot. When war finally came, the Wehrmacht swept through Poland in weeks and conquered France in just 6 weeks. Hitler's string of victories fed his messianic conviction of infallibility. He began to see himself not just as a political leader, but as a military genius. And that's when the disasters began. The first major blunder came in May 1940 during the Battle of France. As British and French forces retreated to Dunkirk, Hitler inexplicably ordered his advancing Panzer divisions to halt. For 3 crucial days, the German armor sat idle, while over 330,000 Allied troops escaped across the Channel. Those soldiers would return 4 years later to liberate Europe. Military historians still debate why Hitler gave that order. Some say he feared the marshy terrain would bog down his tanks. Others suggest he wanted to preserve his armor for future operations. But the result was undeniable. Hitler had snatched defeat from the jaws of total victory. Then came December 11, 1941, perhaps Hitler's most catastrophic decision of all. 4 days after Pearl Harbor, with America focused entirely on Japan, Hitler did something that stunned even his own military leadership. He declared war on the United States. There was no military necessity for this. Under the terms of the tripartite pact with Japan, Germany was only obligated to defend Japan if Japan was attacked, not if Japan attacked first. Hitler's declaration was entirely voluntary. General Alfred Jodl, Hitler's chief military advisor, later recalled that the decision was made without any advice from the Wehrmacht being asked or given. Hitler's Luftwaffe adjutant, Nicholas von Below, was astonished by Hitler's cluelessness about the military potential of the United States. With one speech, just 334 words, Hitler had added the world's greatest industrial power to his list of enemies. While President Roosevelt needed 517 words to declare war on Japan, Hitler sealed the fate of the Third Reich in less than half that long. Churchill, upon hearing the news, reportedly said, "It was truly astounding. I cannot tell you our feelings of triumph. It was a totally irrational thing for him to do, and I think it saved Europe." Historian Sebastian Hoffner would later write, "There is to this day no comprehensible rational explanation for what one is tempted to describe as an act of lunacy." But Hitler wasn't finished making catastrophic decisions. The worst was yet to come. Act 2. Operation Barbarossa and the Moscow Mistake. On June 22, 1941, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. It was the largest military operation in human history. 3.8 million troops attacking across a 3,000-kilometer front. The invasion began brilliantly. Within weeks, German forces had encircled entire Soviet armies. By December, German reconnaissance units stood just 30 kilometers from the Kremlin. Officers could see Moscow's golden domes through their binoculars. But Hitler's interference had already begun undermining his commanders. In August 1941, with Moscow within reach, Hitler overruled his commanders and diverted forces south toward Kiev and the Ukraine. The delay proved fatal. When German forces finally resumed their advance on Moscow, winter had arrived, and they were still wearing summer uniforms. Why? Because Hitler had forbidden the requisition of winter equipment. He feared it would signal to the German population that the war wouldn't be the quick victory he'd promised. By early December 1941, German soldiers were freezing to death at their posts. Over 130,000 cases of frostbite were reported. Frostbite casualties exceeded combat casualties. Tank engines froze solid. Weapons wouldn't fire. The supposedly invincible Wehrmacht ground to a halt. On December 5, 1941, fresh Siberian divisions launched a massive Soviet counteroffensive. The Germans, unable to maneuver in the cold, were driven back 100 to 250 kilometers from Moscow. It was the Wehrmacht's first major defeat since the beginning of the war. Hitler's response? He fired dozens of generals and assumed personal command of the German army. From that moment on, every major military decision would require his approval. And he issued an order that would doom German forces again and again: no retreat under any circumstances. Act 3. Stalingrad, the turning point. If Moscow was Hitler's first disaster, Stalingrad was his greatest. In the summer of 1942, Hitler launched a massive offensive into southern Russia, targeting the oil fields of the Caucasus. The city of Stalingrad sat on the flank of this advance, strategically important, but not the primary objective. But Hitler became obsessed. The city bore Stalin's name. Taking it would be symbolic, a personal victory over his rival. He diverted more and more forces into the grinding urban battle, even as his commanders warned of danger. By November 1942, German forces controlled 90% of the ruined city, but they'd pushed too far. Soviet forces had been quietly massing on their flanks, and the German lines were dangerously overextended, guarded mainly by weaker Romanian and Italian units. On November 19, 1942, the Soviet counteroffensive, Operation Uranus, smashed through those weak flanks. Within 4 days, the entire German Sixth Army, nearly 300,000 men, was encircled inside Stalingrad. Any competent commander would have ordered an immediate breakout. The pocket was still weak. Supplies were available. Escape was possible. Hitler forbade it. Stand and fight, he ordered, not one step back. Field Marshal Erich Manstein organized a relief operation to break through to the trapped army. He urged General Paulus, commanding the Sixth Army, to begin fighting his way out to meet the relief force. But Hitler's order was absolute: no retreat. Paulus stayed in place. Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, assured Hitler his air force could supply the trapped army. They needed 500 tons of supplies daily. The Luftwaffe never delivered more than 150 tons. Usually it was less than 100. Throughout December 1942 and January 1943, the German Sixth Army slowly died. They starved. They froze. They fought with dwindling ammunition against an enemy that grew stronger every day. On February 2, 1943, the remnants of the Sixth Army surrendered. Of the 300,000 men trapped in Stalingrad, only about 6,000 would ever see Germany again. The disaster was entirely Hitler's fault. His obsession with symbolic victories over strategic sense, his refusal to allow tactical retreats, his blind faith in Göring's promises, his micromanagement of forces from hundreds of kilometers away, his insistence on fighting to the last man in hopeless situations. German generals knew it, the German people knew it, and the Allies knew it.
Act 4. The Allies' realization. By 1944, a disturbing pattern had emerged. Every time Hitler made a major strategic decision, it benefited the Allies. British intelligence had been monitoring this pattern carefully. They knew about the assassination plots brewing within the German military. They knew that competent German generals were desperate to remove Hitler from power. And they concluded that Hitler's removal would actually harm the Allied war effort. Consider Operation Foxley, the British Special Operations Executive's detailed plan to assassinate Hitler in 1944. A German prisoner of war had revealed that Hitler took a daily 20-minute walk at his Berghof retreat, unguarded, visible from nearby woods. The SOE recruited a sniper, developed the plan, and prepared to execute it. But the plan was never carried out. Why? The deputy head of SOE's German directorate opposed the operation. His reasoning was coldly pragmatic. Hitler was making terrible strategic decisions. A competent German military leadership might negotiate a separate peace with the West or conduct the war more effectively. Hitler alive meant the war would end sooner with total Allied victory. This thinking was shared across Allied intelligence services. Hitler's pattern of catastrophic decisions had become predictable. He would overrule his generals, refuse to allow tactical retreats, and throw good forces after bad in pursuit of symbolic victories. In June 1944, after D-Day, Hitler made another disastrous decision. Instead of allowing Field Marshal Rommel to conduct a flexible defense and concentrate forces, Hitler insisted on defending every meter of ground. He forbade panzer reserves from moving without his personal approval, but he slept late, and his staff was afraid to wake him. By the time Hitler gave permission to commit the panzers, Allied forces were already firmly established on the beaches. The moment for an effective counterattack had passed. Then came the counteroffensive at Mortain in August 1944. Despite his generals' protests, Hitler ordered an armored thrust toward the sea to cut off American forces. The attack was poorly planned, undersupplied, and launched into the teeth of overwhelming Allied air superiority. It failed catastrophically, trapping German forces in the Falaise pocket, where they were systematically destroyed. Over 50,000 Germans were killed or captured. The defeat turned the Allied breakout into a headlong rush across France. General Omar Bradley later said, "The opportunity Hitler gave us at Mortain was the greatest tactical blunder I've seen in this war." Hitler's defenders later tried to claim these disasters weren't entirely his fault, but the evidence is overwhelming. German generals tried repeatedly to pursue sensible strategies, only to be overruled by the Führer. Those who persisted in giving him unwelcome advice were fired or even executed. Act 5. The Dark Calculation. So why didn't German generals remove Hitler themselves? They tried. There were over 40 known assassination or coup plots against Hitler during the war. The most famous was Operation Valkyrie on July 20th, 1944, the bomb plot that failed when Hitler survived the explosion. But earlier attempts had foundered for a different reason. Hitler's early successes had made him popular. After the Munich Agreement, the fall of France, and the early victories in Russia, plotting against Hitler seemed like treason against a winning cause. By the time Hitler's incompetence became undeniable, it was too late. He'd surrounded himself with fanatical loyalists. He'd purged the military of anyone who might oppose him. He controlled the SS, the Gestapo, and the apparatus of terror. And he'd created a system where telling him the truth was more dangerous than losing battles. After the July 20 plot failed, Hitler's paranoia reached new heights. Over 7,000 people were arrested. Up to 5,000 were executed, including many who had no connection to the plot. Field Marshal Rommel, one of Germany's greatest commanders, was forced to commit suicide, despite only having expressed sympathy for removing Hitler from power. The message was clear. Opposing Hitler meant death, not just for the conspirator, but for their families. So Hitler remained in command, making increasingly irrational decisions as the Reich crumbled around him. In the final months of the war, as Soviet forces closed in on Berlin, Hitler ordered non-existent armies to counterattack. He raged at generals for losing battles they never had the resources to win. He blamed everyone but himself for Germany's defeat. The Allies watched this disintegration with grim satisfaction. Every irrational order, every fired general, every refused retreat hastened Germany's collapse. The dark truth is this: by 1944, Adolf Hitler had become one of the Allies' most valuable assets, not through any intention or design, but through sheer incompetence. His obsession with symbolic victories over strategic sense, his refusal to allow tactical flexibility, his distrust of professional military advice, his micromanagement of forces from hundreds of kilometers away, his insistence on fighting to the last man in hopeless situations. Every one of these tendencies worked in the Allies' favor. A rational German leadership might have evacuated Stalingrad and saved an army. They might have withdrawn from France in good order to defend the Rhine. They might even have negotiated a separate peace with the Western Allies against the Soviet Union. But Hitler would never permit any of these things. His pride, his ideology, and his delusions of military genius doomed Germany to total defeat. The historian Jim Lacey put it perfectly. At almost every point where an important decision was required, the Nazi leader could be counted on to make the one that inadvertently benefited the Allied cause. So when you ask why the Allies didn't assassinate Hitler, or why they didn't celebrate when German officers tried to kill him, the answer is coldly pragmatic. Hitler alive was worth a dozen Allied divisions. His terrible decisions shortened the war and saved Allied lives. It's a disturbing calculation, but in total war, sentiment gives way to strategy. And the strategy was clear. Keep Hitler in command, let him make his catastrophic decisions, and watch Nazi Germany destroy itself from within. Adolf Hitler, the man who fancied himself a military genius, became Germany's greatest liability. And the Allies were only too happy to let him remain in charge until the bitter end. This is the dark reason the Allies kept Hitler alive, because he was the best weapon they had against Nazi Germany.